Hey everyone, Anarch here. Today's video is a continuation of my series, The State is Counter-Revolutionary. And just as the topic of the last video was a historical coverage of the revolutionary period of the USSR, today's video will be a coverage of the aftermath of the Chinese Revolution under Mao. The reason this is part 3 in our video series is because even after an inspection of the USSR, someone might contend that the solution lies in a restrained state, one which is built from an ideology that seeks to dismantle its own power once it has defeated the old order. Mao's China is therefore the perfect project for us to inspect. As we shall see, while Maoism maintained the state apparatus, Mao nonetheless sought significant departures from the Leninist and Marxist ideologies, attempting numerous times to dissolve state bureaucracy, listening to peasant concerns about power hoarding, and letting slack the reins of power at certain key moments. If the state is a body which can conceivably dissolve its own power under the right conditions, one would have to conclude that Maoist China would turn out quite different from the USSR. However, what we will see in this video is a convergence of China upon very similar economic affairs as to what took place in Russia, even though their paths to that end varied wildly. As we proceed, I'd like you to hold this quote by Kropotkin from Are We Good Enough in mind. We earnestly invite those who like to reason for themselves to study the history of any of the great social changes which have occurred in humanity. They will see that history is nothing but a struggle between the rulers and the ruled, the oppressors and the oppressed, in which struggle the practical camp always sides with the rulers and the oppressors, while the unpractical camp sides with the oppressed. This is part 3 of The State is Counter-Revolutionary. Although the story of the Chinese Revolution began just before the Second Sino-Japanese War in the 1930s, let us start instead in 1921. This is the year that the Chinese Communist Party was first fully constituted, although it wouldn't rise to power until decades later. By this point, the USSR was a geopolitical powerhouse, and its influence could be felt in nations all over the region, including China. The USSR, cooperating with the Nationalist Party which ruled China, the Kuomintang, helped build a fully modernized army for the conservative rulership in order to protect their regional control. However, this proved to be an utterly disastrous foray. The Kuomintang had no intentions to yield power to the communists, neither domestically nor abroad, and in 1927, after the GMD had used the communist insurrections to gain unparalleled control over most major Chinese cities, they then turned the modernized army that the USSR had helped them build against the Chinese communists. This event is called the Shanghai Massacre, a nationwide purge of the urban communists, resulting in an estimated 300,000 Communist Party deaths and many more imprisonments. In this, we see a recurring tendency of the USSR to meddle in the affairs of foreign communists and to support existing liberal and nationalist governments, accepting profound compromises in order to gain power within them, but for these compromises to ultimately lead to the destruction of socialism in that project. The Shanghai Massacre is why several decades later, when Mao arrived on the scene, the only constituency that was available for the communists to organize was the rural peasantry. However, despite the orthodox Marxist notions that the peasantry did not contain a socialist revolutionary consciousness, they would find that many of China's peasants were fertile soil for radicalization and organization, having been harassed by high taxation by the government and suffering greatly under conditions of warlordism and gangsterism. The primary difference was that, whereas in Russia dual power had been largely embodied in urban entities which gave direct, bottom-up power to the workers, The peasantry of China would instead be highly motivated by promises to expropriate the land from feudal rentiers and to enact social leveling. Adding to these unique conditions, Mao, unlike many Marxists and Leninists before him, had actually read some anarchist theory. Indeed, he had been one of many Chinese exchange students who had visited France, where anarchism was in vogue at the time before World War I. He said in his interviews with Edgar Snow that while he was in France, "I read some pamphlets on anarchy and was much influenced by them. With a student who used to visit me, I often discussed anarchism and its possibilities in China. At that time, I favored many of its proposals." This is elaborated upon in the work The Chinese Anarchist Movement, where Scalpino and Yu write, "Mao's interest in anarchism was by no means unique. On the contrary, it marked him as a part of the central radical stream of those times. Anarchism preceded Marxism in Northeast Asia as the predominant radical expression of the westernized intellectual. Between 1905 and 1920, anarchist thought was a vital part of the intellectual protest movement in both Japan and China. Indeed, in many respects, it possessed the coveted symbol among intellectuals of being the most scientific, most progressive, most futuristic of all political creeds." But this isn't to suggest that Maoism should be considered part of the anarchist tradition. Quite the contrary. Mao's Leninist and Stalinist influences would largely overwrite these early lessons. But it gives some context to what comes ahead. This unique combination of ideological underpinnings would provide the substrate for a new sort of statist praxis, and with it, a new strain of Marxist theory. In 1937, the Japanese invaded the Chinese mainland and began the Second Sino-Japanese War. Previous to this, China had gained relative stability compared to the previous years. However, in response to a land invasion, the GMD had to print copious amounts of money to fund the conflict, creating terrible inflation and thus leading to starvation and mass unemployment. Making matters worse, as Imperial Japan pillaged its way through the country, it utterly demolished much of the Chinese infrastructure. Under Japanese control, the Chinese workers would spearhead numerous waves of strikes. Although organized to some degree by clandestine urban communists, they were mostly the autonomous action of the Chinese laborers. In the year 1947 alone, there were more than 3 million workers taking part in the strikes, a task it would have been impossible for the communists, severely diminished after the Shanghai Massacre, to have organized alone. In 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union would both intervene, ending the Japanese occupation in China. But while the USSR assisted the Kuomintang in reclaiming their territory, they also looted significant portions of Manchuria to prop up their own economy, loading much of the developed industry onto trains and shipping it back west. And despite the fact that the Kuomintang was handed control of the nation after the Japanese had been ousted, they were not prepared to manage the system that the Japanese imperialists had built, with its Byzantine industrial structures and intense reliance on technicians. Under these conditions, the Chinese Communist Party would organize the peasantry and, to a lesser degree, the urban workers in the coming years, waging a new civil war against the Kuomintang. Although they suffered enormously in this conflict, the communists took over more and more areas of the mainland, where they would institute a highly mixed economic program, largely owing to the different levels of industrialization, but also because of the mismatch of skills, the trained cadres, and the new demands of economic management. For this reason, the cadres would, especially in areas like Manchuria, simply restaff the gang boss system with leaders from the revolutionary urban communists instead. In other areas, some businesses would be run by the workers themselves, even during the period of seizure by the state, but it was by no means the standard arrangement. At the same time, nationalization spiked. Before the war was even over, Sorghum and Steele notes that the new state sector, helmed by the CCP, owned 58% of the country's electric power resources, 68% of coal output, 92% of pig iron production, 97% of steel, 68% of cement, 53% of cotton yarn. It also controlled all railways, most modern communications and transport, and the major share of the banking business and domestic and foreign trade. But these enterprises, despite being under state monopoly, were still yoked to the capitalist imperatives of value accumulation, and were therefore understood as state capitalist rather than socialist. Unlike the USSR, the new Maoist government admitted quite openly that these were state capitalist property relations, and that a national united front in which the proletariat cooperated with the petty and national bourgeois was needed. Mao said plainly that China must utilize all elements of urban and rural capitalism that are beneficial and not harmful to the national economy. Our present policy is to control, not to eliminate, capitalism. This new state, however, would not be a bourgeois republic, Mao argued, because it would be under the leadership of the working class and the Communist Party. In other words, just as Trotsky had criticized Lenin for many years ago, the Maoist state was practicing substitutionism, a sort of metaphysical transformation wherein the state is dubbed a workers' state because it is led by ideological communists who claim to be acting in the interests of the workers. During this period, the main goal of the Communist Party would be to normalize economic organization and bring urban production back to previous levels, while in the countryside, delivering on their promises to expropriate land from the landlords and return it to the peasants. But the countryside was not their focus at this stage. In 1949, Mao declared that the center of gravity of the party's work has shifted from the village to the city. Although some program of productivism was clearly necessary in light of the devastation that had been wrought by years of war with Japan, the choice of class collaboration would also spell the recreation of much of what came before. In many areas, the previous bourgeois would leverage their technical knowledge and ability to secure foreign loans in order to maintain control of the labor process. And this was no mistake. This arrangement was the goal of what was called the coexistence policy seen in the Commune program in 1949. Sorghum and Steele summarizes by saying that it aimed to complete the bourgeois revolution in the cities, utilizing the elements of capitalism that are beneficial and not harmful to the national economy. In other words, to control, not to eliminate capitalism. What this meant was effectively the appeasement of the remaining urban capitalists, who would gradually be bought out of their own industries by the state in exchange for offering their technical expertise to the project of industrial recovery and development. Only a year later, China would sign the Sino-Soviet Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance Treaty, which would establish formal ties between the USSR and China, including an influx of Soviet technicians. These Soviet technicians, having been trained to manage the state capitalism of the USSR, would play a significant role in configuring China's economy in that same image, a constant, countervailing force against China's attempts to experiment in the coming years. As a result, Chuang says, the size of the private sector in this period was significant. Though it composed only 55.8% of the gross output value of the industry as a whole, private production was some 85% of total retail sales, making it central to the circulation of goods. This period, even though temporary, as a wave of nationalization was already beginning, did configure a dangerous aspect of the previous paradigm. The state, already coming to rely heavily on grain from the countryside, enacted a grain standard which would standardize the funneling of harvests from rural to urban areas, widening the rural-urban divide that had been so important to eliminate during the revolution. Ultimately, with much of the gang boss system in place in the port cities, with a significant reliance on previous bourgeois and Soviet engineers, and in maintaining the extraction of grain from the countrysides, the CCP would quickly create a system which harkened back to what had come before. the workers were angered to find how similar the post-revolution economy was to the one they had fought so hard to abolish. Thus, strikes were now once again becoming rampant, and many private owners were simply closing their factories, firing workers, and planning to expropriate their businesses and flee the country instead of deal with the challenges. The CCP, however, would force the business owners to increase wages and improve living standards for those in urban areas. They would also seed new unions into the urban economy and establish a national labor board in hopes that these entities could mediate the needs of the workers with the bourgeois. However, the workers did not just want better wages and living conditions or bodies of mediation with their employers. They wanted socialism. They especially wanted an end to the gang boss system and private ownership. Thus, as wages quickly found a new ceiling, the unions just became industrial bodies to facilitate worker agitation, and there was a real risk in the eyes of the party that they would seize the economy for themselves. For this reason, in 1952, the party underwent a series of actions called the Five Anti-movement that were supposedly aimed at rooting out infiltration by the rulers of the old system, but which would ultimately serve to suppress the strike waves. This would be a recurring theme in the response of the state in the coming years, to avoid systemic critiques and to instead blame individual operators within the system for incomplete devotion to ideological orthodoxy as a tool to suppress dissent. For this reason, the solution was also non-systemic. Instead of giving the means of production to the workers, the state instead encouraged workers to carry out elaborate denunciations of their capitalist employers. The party would also use this as an opportunity to seize over $1.7 billion in fines from private enterprises for engaging in, as they said, various illegal transactions. This, plus various denunciation campaigns, would create a pliable private industry, ready to be seized and transformed by the CCP. But, as Sorghum and Steele notes, while successful in restraining the workers from a direct seizure of power and in crippling the influence of private capital, these programs led to a dip in production as workers and union cadre were constantly mobilized in attacks against their employers, and enterprises were stripped of their working capital countrywide. The Five Anti-movement, at its height, caused a number of enterprises to cease operations and interfered with production in many others, while also setting a dangerous precedent of giving workers power over their managers and enterprise owners. Fearing economic stagnation and renewed demands for a seizure of enterprises by workers, the party began rolling back the reform movement. As a result of copying this Soviet project of class collaboration, Stephen Anders in China's Industrial Revolution, Politics, Planning, and Management noted that by 1953, approximately 80% of the managerial personnel were of bourgeois background, and 37% of these were pre-1949 graduates, returned overseas students, or factory owners. By 1953, only 20% or so of managerial and technical personnel were made up of urban Communist Party members, promoted workers or directors, and trade union officials appointed directly by the party. In 1951, seeing the trend toward nationalization and central management, Gao Gong, a party leader, was known to have said, "We are not God, and we cannot work out a perfect plan." It is ironic, then, that Gao Gong himself would be set to the work of creating just such a perfect plan, in the form of China's first 5-year plan, helping develop some of the early Taylorist quota setting and production goals in emulation of the USSR. Although the beginning of this era would see the toleration of forms of worker control, the 5-year plan would heavily favor the Soviet style of state centralization and Taylorism. Overall, implementation would be uneven and worker revolts would pockmark institution, but the Soviet model, with its reliance on central management and investment in heavy industry, would eventually win out. In his book Mao's China and After, Maurice Meisner discusses the effect of this industrial transition. The decision to adopt the Soviet model of industrialization necessitated Soviet-type forms of political organization and state administration. Centralized economic planning demanded the bureaucratization and routinization of state and society. The cadres of a revolutionary party were transformed into administrators and bureaucratic functionaries. Workers in factories were subjected to increasing control by factory managers. The revolutionary ideal of the guerrilla generalist was replaced by a newfound faith in the virtues of specialization and the technological specialist. Old egalitarian ideals clashed with a new hierarchy of ranks and new patterns of social inequality. The revolutionary faith in the initiative of the masses faded as industrialization demanded authoritarian discipline, social stability, and economic rationality. Socialist goals were postponed and partly ritualized in favor of the immediate and all-embracing goal of economic development. The tendency for revolutionaries to become bureaucratic rulers began in 1949, but it was now vastly accelerated. Gaogong's rise would not last long, however. The first internal party purges would begin in 1954, wherein Gaogong would be among those accused of attempting a coup of the state. Ultimately, Gao would commit suicide, but news would not be given to the populace until an entire year later. As a result of his work, however, Sorghum and Steele notes that government orders as a percentage of total private industrial output rose from a mere 12% in 1949 to 82% by 1955. In order to soften backlash by the former owners of these enterprises, the state agreed to reimburse them at a fixed rate of interest out of future revenue. The first 5-year plan had produced a great deal of economic growth, but the people of this new society, both workers and many of the party revolutionaries, were becoming disillusioned with what they saw playing out. Even the general increase in wages during this period would be distributed very unevenly and would come along with intricate piecemeal systems and incentive structures. Meisner says, as in the Soviet Union, the disappearance of the old economically based ruling classes was accompanied by the emergence of a new politically based bureaucratic ruling class, albeit one in still embryonic form whose members saw themselves as servants of the people. This would create tension, however, because the old cadres had come from a revolutionary milieu and were the carriers of the values of a Spartan and egalitarian style of life and work. In the early years of the People's Republic, they'd been treated in a relatively egalitarian fashion, the government providing housing, food, and a small monetary allowance for the basic necessities of life. By 1955, however, cadres were divided into 26 distinct ranks, with corresponding salaries ranging from 30 to 560 yuan, $12 to $224 per month. China was experiencing many of the exact same struggles as the USSR had as they passed through this process. Meisner continues. For the workers, the industrialization drive meant subjection to increasingly strict codes of labor discipline. It also meant increasing wage and status differentials within their ranks. The more skilled workers put in charge of factory work teams or became foremen exercising authority over fellow workers. Before the first 5-year plan, trade unions had acquired some degree of independence as representatives of the interests of the workers. But by the mid-1950s, the unions had become instruments of state policy designed to raise workers' productivity. In the spring of 1957, discontent had risen to such a level that the strikes would utterly dwarf all other waves that had come before. Elizabeth Perry wrote about this in her piece, Shanghai's Strike Wave of 1957. Major labor disturbances erupted at 587 Shanghai enterprises involving nearly 30,000 workers, more than 200 of these incidents including factory walkouts, while another 100 or so involved organized slowdowns of production. The laborers were furious. In fact, they were so mobilized toward action that they began to relate their struggle to the Hungarian rebellions, chanting, "Let's create another Hungarian incident," and saying their conflict would proceed from district to city to party central to communist international. They built bodies of insurrection, distributing handbills in the streets to publicize their demands, and forming autonomous unions. Secret societies like those before the upheaval were now arising, and there was planning for the next revolt. In fear of what these revolts could become, and seeing the resistance against Soviet interventions in Eastern Europe, in 1956, the CCP would encourage a vigorous campaign of criticism toward the party called the 100 Flowers Campaign. The name came from a poem, one line of which read, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." Accounts differ quite significantly over whether this campaign was carried out in good faith by the party or whether it was a ploy in order to draw out dissent. But what is clear is that it was motivated by a desire to lessen tensions and resolve contradictions that had been created by state capitalist implementation. But nothing of the sort took place. Instead, a deluge of criticism was unleashed on the party and its bureaucracy, claiming it had betrayed its socialist principles and that the state was becoming a new class of rulers. A leader of the Peasant and Workers' Democratic Party was known to have said, "In leading the masses to carry through the revolution in the past, the party stood among the masses. After the liberation, it felt the position had changed, and instead of standing among the masses, it stood on the back of the masses and ruled the masses." Another veteran communist revolutionary echoed this. In a lengthy letter to Mao and the Central Committee, "There is a privileged class in existence. Even if a national united class has not yet been formed, the embryo of this class is forming and developing." Even Mao recognized that this central critique was true, even going so far as to locate this bureaucratic class among the Communist Party. A dangerous tendency has shown itself of late among many of our personnel, an unwillingness to share the joys and hardships of the masses, a concern for personal position and gain. Yet, despite this seeming agreement, the party would go on to suppress the 100 Flowers movement and wage what it called the anti-rightist campaign in response. In this campaign, the party condemned many of those taking place in the 100 Flowers movement as rightists or bad elements. Intellectuals and students would be grouped in as rightists, and sometimes given the benefit of being asked to publicly renounce their previous views and reform, whereas workers were grouped in as bad elements, which condemned them to be treated like nothing better than common criminals. Workers and even some union officials who had agitated in the strikes and who lobbied anti-bureaucratic criticisms were often imprisoned, sent to labor camps, and even executed. Sorghum and Steele notes that when high-ranking ACFTU officials stood behind the workers, even going so far as to advocate for independent unions, the result was vilification, dismissal, and a general purge of the ACFTU. Ultimately, the inability of the dissident labor movement to develop a general strike in the face of prolific state repression would spell the destruction of the 100 Flowers movement. But while such a brush with disaster may have convinced other governments to be wary of experimentation and uncertainty, the Chinese Communists would then undertake one of the most ambitious projects carried out in human history: the Great Leap Forward. To understand why the Chinese Communist Party turned its focus to rural areas during this period, it's necessary that we come to understand the dynamics of the post-revolutionary countryside and Mao's ideology toward those elements. Notably, he diverged from Marx, who thought that the proletariat were the only class where a truly revolutionary consciousness would arise. Mao instead believed that, because the peasants had not yet been propagandized by capitalist social relations, and that they were the most incentivized to escape their conditions, they were the most revolutionary class, not the proletariat. However, projects being carried out in the countryside, while delivering on the desires the peasants had before the revolution to give over ownership of the land, were also concentrating wealth in the hands of many of the small proprietors. Now controlling their land and producing the grain which fueled the needs of the growing Chinese economy, it was feared that they were becoming a new capitalist class. The task of confiscating the land of the rich peasants and equalizing the share with those less fortunate had been postponed until somewhere around 1955, but now it was done with a brutal quickness. In less than a year, the entirety of the Chinese peasant population had been forced into collectives, and as expected, this process was not carried out without resistance by the peasants. There were riots in many rural areas during 1957 and general unrest, some of them even forcefully dissolving the cooperatives they were forced into. But whereas the CCP had suppressed the 100 Flowers movement in the urban areas through the anti-rightist campaign, they would need a much different approach to the rural areas. Although the pre-revolutionary state had been worthy of overthrow, it had also been much less present, accommodating the peasants to lifestyles of self-sufficiency and distance from the ruling class. For this reason, they were not simply motivated by promises of socialism, but were also quite anarchic in their desire to have state interference reduced in their lives. With all of these factors together, and in perhaps one of the boldest decisions of the entire Chinese revolutionary project, Mao decided to send a huge number of party apparatchiks and urban intelligentsia into the countryside, demanding that they go and work the fields and labor alongside the peasants. This move would dissolve much of the bureaucracy of the Central Party, but it would also concentrate power even further in the hands of Mao and his inner circle, as it decreased the number of power holders in the state and thus decreased internal competition. Indeed, the state still maintained absolute control during this period. There were simply fewer bureaucrats involved in the construction and administration of that control. Meanwhile, as the bureaucrats flooded into the countryside, the peasants were told through official proclamations to carry out a variety of economic experiments, and that they would be given complete freedom in doing so. However, in reality, the state would pick from the vast array which arose those which were most preferable to its needs, and exerted heavy pressure on the peasants to abide by it. That preference was called the commune model. In this commune model, all property was shared among several thousand households. All activities, farming, food preparation, and so on, were carried out in large communal facilities. Yet the administration of labor was not determined openly and democratically by the people. Instead, in this model, administrators, often party bureaucrats banished from the central apparatus, would determine everything about the workdays of the peasants: what fields they would work, how long they would labor at each, and what production quotas would be set. In this way, although property had been communalized, control was handed over to 1,000 petty dictators, and the workers therefore had less control over their work than they had had before during the years of individual farmship, which they had become accustomed to. Even Ma Qi, a writer who was sympathetic to the policies of this era, says in his work The People's Communes that the commune movement as a whole was largely compulsory in character. Though the CCP agrees in words with the principles of voluntary consent by the peasants, it has not complied with it in deed. The People's Communes started as an experiment in April 1958, but the documents concerning them were first published in August 1958. Then, in a period of not more than 2 months, 99% of the rural population was organized into communes. In such a short period, the superiority of the communes could not be proved by an increase in production and by an improvement in the standard of living of the people. Also, there was an insufficient time for discussion among the masses on how to form the communes. All was decided simply by decree in this hastily organized movement. In these new dictatorial communes, the workers were held to highly regimented and militaristic standards. Maurice Meisner summarizes in Mao's China and After. "Our revolutions are like battles," Mao had declared in January 1958, and by July, peasants on communes were organized in battalions, marching off to labor in the fields and steppe, with martial music blaring from loudspeakers. The slogans of the time called upon the masses not to collectivize, but also to militarize, combatize, and disciplinize. Although the militarization of work was ideologically rationalized by Marxist references to the Commune as a community dominated by the armed masses, the purpose was increased labor productivity. But the result was to be the physical exhaustion of the peasants, who were subjected to intolerable physical demands and an increasingly unrealistic extension of the working day. Indeed, the party cadres forced the workers to extend their work to 11 or even 12 hours a day, and such demands were not borne without complaint. In the Honan province, for example, the first secretary of the party, Puan Fusheng, would say, "Peasants' production enthusiasm is not as high as in 1951. We are sitting on a volcano. The peasants will revolt and may reject the leadership of the Communist Party. The peasants were not equal to beasts of burden in the past, but are the same as beasts of burden today. Yellow oxen are tied up in the house, and human beings are harnessed in the field. Girls and women pull plows, harrows, with their wombs hanging down." For these complaints, the Deputy First Secretary, the Secretary of the Provincial Committee, and Peng Fusheng would all be purged from the local leadership. Meanwhile, the party pushed a plan called the Four Pests Campaign, which instructed the people to kill all mosquitoes, flies, mice, and sparrows. Done with the belief that these pests were leading to lessened grain harvests, the policy precipitated an ecological catastrophe. The sparrows had been the environmental check on the locusts, and with the sparrow population in rapid decline, the locusts would therefore boom wildly out of control, decimating the harvest. This on top of what was already turning out to be a weak season. But the unfortunate intersection of events does not end here. The state also insisted on higher agricultural productivity so that it could export a record amount of grain to the urban centers. All the while, Mao's party cadres in the villages were falsely reporting that the harvests were increasing as the new program moved forward, giving the impression that this central demand could actually be achieved. Altogether, in a horrific mismatch of state priorities and the needs of the masses, the party exported the food that was needed to sustain the peasantry while they were in more need of food than usual. All the while, the state insisted that many peasants in agricultural areas be diverted into steel production instead of the production of more grain in what was called the Backyard Steel Campaign. All of this together led to one of the worst famines in human history, lasting from roughly 1959 to 1961. Workers, under military regimentation by party cadres forced to kill animals which would consume the locusts, destroying their crops, were being marched at the end of full workdays to distant fields, only to return home and produce low-quality steel in backyard furnaces. This confluence of inept leadership and labor coercion would lead to the loss of the Chinese Communist Party's mandate among the rural peasantry. Terrified to see what was unfolding, the CCP took the opportunity to re-centralize power, to reintroduce market dynamics, and to concentrate production in a small number of profitable enterprises. The Great Leap Forward would therefore be abandoned. Indeed, this failure would prove to be one of the most important turning points in Chinese history. To the party bureaucrats, this was not a disaster of mismatched priorities. It was a practical failure of the workers to manage themselves. From this point on, decentralization would be seen as untenable in the eyes of the party, and Mao's internal control would be significantly weakened. The party's retreat into more traditional modes of market operation and their disputes over his leadership did not cause Mao to demur from experimentation, however. He still saw the bureaucrats as the main opposition to socialist progress. In 1965, he would say, "The bureaucratic class is a class in sharp opposition to the working class and the poor and lower middle peasants. How can these people who have become, or are in the process of becoming, bourgeois elements sucking the blood of the workers be properly recognized? These people are the objectives of the struggle, the objectives of the revolution. It's not difficult to hear echoes of Mao's early foray with anarchism in these words, but we should not get too carried away, as Mao never conceived of the possibility that the state could be abolished. Instead, he thought that the ills of the state could be diminished through staunch reductions in bureaucracy and by marshalling the masses to brutally criticize unjust hierarchies that were arising within those bureaucratic organizations. This concept is what draws the line of coherence between the events of the 100 Flowers movement and the Cultural Revolution and its ensuing suppression. In revolutionary China, criticism was always called for, but it was only meant to be a tool in service of the goals of the leadership. Not always the narrow goals of Mao's self-interest per se, but always within the confines of the critiques he had of bureaucracy, and no further. In 1966, Mao would push forward with what is called the Cultural Revolution. In some ways, a more ambitious version of the 100 Flowers movement, this era would be predicated upon a call to open criticism and revolt, but would also come along with calls to organize new forms of social and economic arrangement, not just in the countrysides, as it had been during the Great Leap, but now in the urban centers. Just as "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend" was the rallying cry of the 100 Flowers movement, the rallying call of the Cultural Revolution would be, "It is right to rebel." And so they did, far more radically than the party had ever anticipated. In 1966, a group of students called the Red Guard began criticizing the school officials for being intellectual elitists and representing bourgeois tendencies, and were denounced as counter-revolutionaries by the school administration. However, after Mao read their manifesto, he sided with the students, then had it aired on national radio and published it in newspapers. This turned the Red Guards into a movement, now comprising students and young intellectuals all over the nation. In January of next year would come one of the most promising attempts of the Cultural Revolution, the Shanghai Commune. The Shanghai Commune was notable, of all of those that were developed during this period, for attempting to emulate the style of the Paris Commune most closely. And it was no coincidence that such an affair arose in Shanghai. Shanghai was not only the center of modern industrial radicalism, it was the very birthplace of the Chinese Communist Party. Further, to add to its threat to state hegemony, it was one of the most populated areas of the entire country. The Shanghai workers, although deeply beset by internal disputes, were extremely radical and intended to take the ideas of the Cultural Revolution to their furthest extent. They made up a list of demands. The workers demanded that the headquarters be recognized as a legal organization under the dictatorship of the proletariat, thereby challenging the party's monopoly of political power. They insisted that the workers be provided with the means to organize all factories in the city, and they called for the municipal government to give a public accounting of its administration. However, the instructions from the capital told them to return to work and to fulfill 8-hour workdays, warning the Shanghai organizers that it was a dire provocation to defy the Central Party's instructions, and reminding them that their place as workers was to work. But the workers were fearless. Outraged, some of them took a train to Beijing to deliver the demands to Mao himself, which led to a 3-day standoff between the workers and the party cadres. At the end, however, the party conceded to their demands. This, and the enormous wave of strikes and direct action by radicals against party bureaucrats, would come to be called the January Storm, or sometimes the January Revolution. The state would quickly begin working out how to subvert this new body of worker control. Unlike the Soviet Union, however, the Chinese party would be much more clever in its machinations. They didn't crush the Shanghai Commune by force. Instead, they used the existence of temporary transition leaders in the commune to undermine the delegate democracy that the workers were trying to create. Like the Great Leap, the party saw the multitude of experiments playing out, and they had a preference for which would win the day. Where the workers had demanded a leadership elected directly by the masses and able to be recalled at their whim, Beijing demanded that they instead emulate projects that were taking place elsewhere and implement top-down, centralized leadership. When one of the heads of the Shanghai Commune, Zhuang Chunkao, went to visit with Mao in Beijing, he told Mao that they were planning on eliminating all the heads of the commune in emulation of the Paris Commune, and it was conveyed to him that this would not be allowed to happen. Mao was known to say of these demands, "This is extreme anarchism. It is most reactionary. In reality, there will always be heads." The structure that the party preferred was called a revolutionary committee, and it was predicated upon cooperation between the mass organization, party cadres, and the army. The army, being the direct representation of the party's will, would become the dominant partner in these revolutionary committees, destroying what power the workers had seized through the January Revolution. At the demands of the state, when Zhuang Chunkao returned, he dissolved the Shanghai Commune and instead transformed it into a revolutionary committee with top-down control. Projects elsewhere which instated these revolutionary committees would also see nothing more than reformist progress, instead doomed to watch the goals of the Cultural Revolution degrade in slow motion over the next decade. A year later, in 1968, another group of students, their name abbreviated as Shangwu Lian, wrote a scathing critique titled "Whither China?" In it, they called out what they saw as the counter-revolutionary attitude of the army and the new state government. Before the liberation, the army and the people fought together to overthrow imperialism, bureaucratic capitalism, and feudalism. The relation between the army and the people was like that between fish and water. After the liberation, some of the armed forces in the revolution have not only changed their blood and flesh relations with the people that they obtained before the liberation, but have even become tools for suppressing revolution. They were also outraged at what had been done to the Shanghai Commune, saying, "Why did Comrade Mao Zedong, who energetically advocated the Commune, suddenly oppose the establishment of Shanghai People's Commune in January? That is something which the revolutionary people find it hard to understand. Chairman Mao, who foresaw the Commune as a political structure which must be realized in the First Cultural Revolution, suddenly put forward, revolutionary committees are fine." Their critiques were sometimes even independent discoveries of ideas that anarchists had warned about almost a century before. Facts, as revealed by the masses in their wrath, told people initially that this class of red capitalists had completely become a decaying class that hindered the progress of history, and that the relations between them and the people in general had changed from relations between the leaders and the led, to those between the rulers and the ruled, the exploiters and the exploited, from the relations of revolutionaries of equal standing to those between the oppressors and the oppressed. The special privileges and high salaries of the class of red capitalists was built on the basis of the oppression and exploitation of the broad masses of the people. In order to realize the People's Commune of China, it was necessary to overthrow this class. The fruit of victory of both the January Revolution has been basically usurped by the bourgeois. Social reforms were aborted, social changes were not consolidated and thoroughly realized, and the end of the first great cultural revolution has not been reached. As the masses have said, everything remains the same after much ado. The ultimate failure of Mao's statist program to create socialism and his death shortly after would lead to the final abandonment of socialist experimentation in China. This event would be what precipitated a change of power within the party and the rise of Dengism. Sadly, we have not yet seen the defeat of the enemies of Shangwu Lian in China. Quite the opposite, the authoritarian bureaucracy that outraged the Chinese laborers has grown to catastrophic proportions. In 2011, a man named Zhu Liji, a worker at a Foxconn factory, wrote a poem describing what it felt like to be a worker in modern China, titled, "I Fall Asleep just standing like that. The paper before my eyes fades yellow. With a steel pen I chisel on it an even black, full of working words, workshop, assembly line, machine, work card, overtime, wages. They've trained me to become docile. Don't know how to shout or rebel, how to complain or denounce, only how to silently suffer exhaustion. When I first set foot in this place, I hoped only for that gray payslip on the 10th of each month, to grant me some belated solace. For this I had to grind away my corners, grind away my words, refuse to skip work, refuse sick leave, refuse leave for private reasons, refuse to be late, refuse to leave early. By the assembly line, I stood straight like iron, hands like flight. How many days, how many nights did I, just like that, standing, fall asleep? Zhu Liji would go on to take his own life just 3 years later in 2014. What is left of the dream that so many died for? Nothing but symbols and flags and glory by association. The only succor for those revolutionaries now living there are the aesthetics of their rulers. In the last part of this video, we will return to an inspection of theory, so that perhaps we can arrive at a synthesis of the thoughts of the many great thinkers we have inspected, and understand what it was that took place in these projects. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to help spread the work I'm doing here, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Also, if you want to help me eat and pay the bills, become a patron at the Patreon link below. Anyway, I'll see you next time.